What happens if there are two rival combinations and one lot said, we can form a government, and the other one said, no, we can? What happens then?
It could be messy after the election if the Conservatives' share of seats and Labour's share of seats are sufficiently close that either Conservative or Labour could claim to put together a possible government. And if they can't work it out who is going to form the government, then the default position is that the incumbent Prime Minister, David Cameron, has the right to meet the new Parliament and to test whether his government can still command confidence.
So will the leader of the largest single party become the new Prime Minister?
Not necessarily. The test of who becomes the new Prime Minister is who can command confidence in the new House of Commons. And that might be the leader of the second largest party, if that party can put together a bigger combination of support parties than the largest single party. And we have been here once before, in 1924, when the Conservatives were the largest single party in the House of Commons, but a minority government was formed by Labour, who were then the second largest party.
What role will the Queen play?
The Queen formally has the role of appointing, as Prime Minister, the person who commands the confidence of the new Parliament. But she stays right out of the negotiations, and she has no formal power. She will wait for the political parties to negotiate, to work out who can command confidence in the new Parliament, and then she'll appoint that person as Prime Minister.
Will another hung Parliament lead inevitably to another coalition?
No, it's by no means certain that hung parliaments necessarily result in coalitions. And we mustn't make the mistake of assuming that 2015 will be a replay of 2010. It's equally possible in a hung parliament that a minority government is formed. And indeed, in British history, we've had as many minority governments as coalition governments. If you look back at the 20th century, there were 20 governments during the 20th century, and half of those were minorities or coalitions. As it happens, there were equal numbers of each. There were 5 minority governments and there were 5 coalition governments.
What's the role of the civil service in all this?
The civil service will be there in the background to support the negotiations if the political parties want them to. But it's entirely up to the political parties how much support they look for. So it may be that the civil service just provides rooms and tea and coffee, photocopying, those kinds of things. But it may be that the parties in negotiation want some information. They might ask, so if we tried to get rid of the Trident nuclear warheads in Scotland, would that breach any of our international legal obligations? That kind of thing. And the civil service will be on hand to answer those questions.
It looks as if the negotiations could take a long time.
Yes, I believe that it'll take a lot longer than 5 days, for 3 reasons. One, there'll be more parties involved in the negotiations this time, almost certainly more than the 3 main parties involved last time. Secondly, the members of those parties, in particular the Parliamentary Party, will want to be consulted more closely than in 2010. In 2010, only the Liberal Democrats consulted their party very fully. And thirdly, I expect that the resulting agreement, whether it's a support agreement for a minority government or coalition agreement, is likely to be quite detailed. And let's not forget that in 2010, the detailed coalition agreement, the programme for government, came out 13 days after the election.
Could there be a second election?
There's a lot of loose talk, both amongst Labour and the Conservatives, about the possibility of forming a minority government and then, after 12, 18 months, holding a second election to try to improve their numbers, as Harold Wilson did in the 1964 government and again in 1974. But they don't take account of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which has seriously changed the picture. Under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, there are only 2 roads to dissolution of Parliament. One is by a 2/3 majority of all the members of the House of Commons, and the other is by a formal confidence motion passed by the normal threshold of 50% plus 1. And Parliament cannot be dissolved in any other way. The prerogative power of dissolution, whereby the Prime Minister went along and asked the Queen to dissolve Parliament, has gone. It's been abolished. So I don't see any possibility of a Prime Minister after 12 or 18 months trying to get a second election unless they can persuade the House of Commons to dissolve itself.
Well, why not abolish the Fixed Term Parliament Act, as a lot of politicians have been saying?
I think it would be very difficult to repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act for two reasons. One is, on this hypothesis, there's a minority government in office, so it doesn't have a majority to carry legislation through. And secondly, it would have to say what it would put in place of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Would it go back to the old prerogative power of dissolution? I think that would be a very hard sell for a Prime Minister, because it gave a significant advantage to the incumbent Prime Minister to decide on the timing of the next election.
Does the prospect of a large number of SNP MPs actually change the dynamics of the situation here? Might that create a different situation that hasn't been accounted for before?
Well, the SNP are definitely a new factor in 2015 because of their likely numbers. It's quite possible that they will be the third largest party in the new House of Commons, putting the Lib Dems into fourth place. And so they're almost certainly going to be players in the negotiations. And in return for supporting a government, they will want something in return. We don't yet know for certain what that will be. We've seen indications from speeches by their leader, Nicola Sturgeon. Interestingly, they don't include a referendum on independence as one of the things they will be asking for.
Now, the advice you've been given and you've set out so cogently isn't written down in law. There's no absolute reason why they should follow it. What happens if they just don't obey by the rules? What happens then?
Well, there is a big gap in the rules, and that is in relation to who is the first mover after the election, if both major parties can credibly claim to form a government. And I think that could be quite messy in terms of their public statements and in terms of manoeuvring with the other political parties. But for me, that's the only worrying gap in the rules. I think all the other rules are likely to be observed.